following program deals with a controversial subject. The theories expressed are not the only possible interpretation. Viewers are invited to make a judgment based on all available information.
This is your captain speaking. We are beginning our descent into madness.
Open your mind.
And we are back for another edition of West of the Rockies. I'm Frank. Thank you guys for sticking around. I know it's late, but we have a really cool show lined up for everyone tonight. Real quick, don't forget to click subscribe, like, and comment if you're interested in the topics we cover on this show. Tonight, I am thrilled to welcome John Potash back to West of the Rockies. For those not familiar, John Potash is an author and filmmaker known for his investigative work exploring the intersection of politics, culture, and social justice. He is the author of the book Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the CIA's War on Musicians and Activists, first published in 2015. In this book, John examines the alleged use of illegal drugs as a tool by intelligence agencies, corporations, and governments to control and undermine social movements. A few years later, in 2018, he released a documentary based on his Drugs as Weapons Against Us book, which explored this topic visually, incorporating interviews, archival footage, and extensive research. John Potash has appeared on various media platforms, including C-SPAN's American History TV and Coast to Coast AM, to discuss his research on targeting influential cultural figures. He completed his graduate studies at Columbia University and has over 25 years of experience working with individuals with mental health and addiction issues. He currently calls Baltimore his home. I've had the pleasure of interviewing John a while back on his documentary and book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us. Tonight, he's back to talk about the follow-up to that documentary titled CIA Drugs or Us, released in 2024, and it's currently available to stream on YouTube and Amazon Prime Video, among other platforms. In this sequel, John Potash delves into the historical and ongoing involvement of the CIA in drug trafficking, its impact on society, and how this agency allegedly uses drugs as tools for social control by targeting influential cultural figures and activists such as John Lennon, Kurt Cobain, and Tupac Shakur. I'm looking forward to diving into these topics with John, so without further ado, let me welcome John Potash to West of the Rockies. John, thanks so much for taking the time to join us tonight, and Happy New Year.
Hey, Frank. Happy New Year to you.
As mentioned at the top of the show, this new documentary, CIA Drugs or Us, is a follow-up to your first documentary, Drugs as Weapons Against Us. What events or what series of events made you decide to put out a sequel?
Yeah, so I had written the book Drugs as Weapons Against Us back in 2015, and I ended up making a film about that in 2019. And films usually take me about at least a couple of years to make and get out there. So in between the 2017, 2019, a lot of new information came out, such as a book by a award-winning reporter named Tom O'Neill, who came out with the book Chaos about the Manson family and MK Ultra, the CIA's MK Ultra program, which is the majority of what my Drugs as Weapons Against Us film is about, and my CIA Drugs as Us film is about. Then more information came out about John Lennon, and more information came out about both Tupac Shakur and Kurt Cobain. So this made me want to put another, a sequel out there.
In this sequel, you also cover the Netflix documentary series, The Keepers. Why did you choose to include that in this film?
So the last third of my film is about the issues around the Keepers And The Keepers was an Emmy Award-winning docuseries that came out on Netflix in 2017 about the church sex abuse scandal in Baltimore and really other cities too. But I focused mostly on the Baltimore situation because I had the most information on that. So I sent evidence that was in my mind when I saw the docuseries to the star civilian investigator of The Keepers, a woman named Gemma Hoskins, and showed her evidence that because I believed it was related to the CIA's MK Ultra program, and she kind of took that evidence and information and ran with it in terms of she re-interviewed all these victims, and she interviewed the psychiatrist who wrote a book called CIA Doctors about MK Ultra, and then she let me use all of her podcasts or interviews for this new film.
Watching that part of the documentary reminded me of how far and wide the MK Ultra net appears to stretch. On that subject, and I know we previously spoke about this in our past interview, I'll be sure to link it in the description for those watching it on YouTube if they want to check it out. But can you briefly talk about how the CIA's MK Ultra program has its roots in Nazi Germany?
Yeah, Professor Al McCoy wrote about how Kurt Plautner, I believe his name was one German Nazi scientist who was experimenting with psychedelics on concentration camp victims, and other Nazi scientists that were using different drugs to experiment on concentration camp victims were brought into the CIA when it was formed in 1947 through an operation called Paperclip to take those experiments into MK Ultra, where they continue those kind of ghastly experiments.
To your knowledge, has the MK Ultra program ended, or is it still active today?
I think it's still happening today. A key FBI counterintelligence program agent named Wes Swearingen wrote a whistleblowing memoir about that and said that even though they officially closed COINTELPRO and the counterintelligence program, the FBI closed it in 1971, they kept it going under different names, at least until the mid-1990s when he came out with his memoir. And of course, I show the evidence that the targeting of Tupac Shakur was a latter-day counterintelligence program. And so, a CIA whistleblower named John Stockwell, who I saw speak and I got to talk to after his speech in Baltimore in 1991, he talked about in a interview later that, yes, the CIA's MK Ultra program did continue under different names well past the 1973 date that the head of the CIA ordered all the MK Ultra documents shredded. And the estimates are they shredded about 200,000 documents, but he didn't realize that there was 20,000 copies of the documents still being saved in the accounting department. He didn't get to shred, and those were discovered and revealed by U.S. congressmen who were looking that up. But the church was very much investigating that, and so those 20,000 documents came out and were revealed to the public, though most of the press, refused to look at them because they're sadly, I show the evidence in cohorts with some of these CIA agents and the oligarchs that own much of the press.
A pivotal moment when discussing the CIA and its activities is President John F. Kennedy's attempt to dismantle the CIA. As the famous quote attributed to JFK goes, he wanted to, quote, splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. What can you tell me about that and how it relates to the MK Ultra program? Was Kennedy aware of the CIA's involvement in these types of projects?
So when President John F. Kennedy tried to close down the MK Ultra program in 1961, when he came across it, he officially closed it down. He fired the CIA director, but they kept it running behind his back, and he found it again before his assassination. He closed it down again. They changed the name to MK Search. It continued under that name until 1973. So again, I argue and show the evidence that, yes, it did continue.
In your documentaries, you present information that shows the apparent attempts to control influential cultural figures using MK Ultra tactics. What is the profile that would make someone an ideal target of the MK Ultra program? And once their target is acquired, how are these individuals used?
The type of subjects that they target are the kind of targets that are going against what I call the oligarchs, the wealthiest families in this country that really run this country. And so their agenda is to stop any public figure that can counter what they're trying to do. Is they try to manipulate public opinion. And, you know, as the CIA, you might have heard, the CIA's motive is to control people's hearts and minds. They can't control them physically because people outnumber them. You know, the oligarchical families are maybe anywhere from a few dozen to maybe a few hundred oligarchical billionaire families. And so when they control the media, they think that we, will fight for something that may not be good for us, and thinking that we're fighting for a just war in, say, Iraq, to invade Iraq because there's weapons of mass destruction. Then we come to find that there were no weapons of mass destruction. We just caused the death of over 1 million people in Iraq. And so these are some of the things that they don't want anyone with popularity to rise up and speak out against.
As explained in your documentary, CIA Drugs for Us, these oligarchical families you mentioned appear to have a hand in drug running and major armed conflicts around the world, among other activities. Can you tell us who they are, how they operate, and what they hope to achieve?
The Rockefellers, the JP Morgans, the Harrimans, the Carnegies, and however many others that we just don't even know the names of. But I tell some of their names of the Cabots that had started Harvard University, that were originally involved in opium shipping. The Russells that started Yale University and other, and the Lowe's of Columbia University, and et cetera. They are basically the kind of the wealthiest oligarchical families, and they have proven to be incredibly racist and incredibly prejudiced against all but their fellow super wealthy white Anglo-Saxon Protestant families. And they basically are hyper-capitalist in terms of being incredibly greedy, wanting to use U.S. military to try to take more and more resources from other countries for themselves. And they don't have any thought of social justice. They are against civil rights. They attack countries for oil. They attack countries for their opium crops. And the opium crops are particularly lucrative because heroin is so costs so much on the black market. And of course, cocaine is very expensive on the black market too, and that's why they also were involved with the groups that were helping traffic the cocaine from the South American, Central American countries up to North America and to other areas of the world.
The Vietnam War is a war that haunts the United States to this day. In your documentary, CIA Drugs for Us, you present information to the viewer that shows that this war was a cover for basically a major drug running operation. Can you tell us a bit more about that and how the oligarch families are involved?
When they wanted to control the opium crops of the Golden Triangle of the Vietnam area, which was the best place to grow poppy fields and that produce opium and heroin, they pushed this Vietnam War, saying we were fighting to stop communist takeover. And really, it was just, fighting to control a region to get more control over the opium crops, but of course, they could push, there's other reasons too, but that was a big one. And if I have Judy Woodruff talking in a documentary, it was an ABC or NBC documentary, where she basically says the CIA documents say they were shipping heroin from the Vietnam area to the United States. And I have a CIA, agent, whistleblower John Stockwell, saying, yes, his fellow agents were shipping heroin from the Vietnam area to the U.S. So when we had John Lennon rise up in popularity and say he's against the war, that helps the agenda of the people wanting peace. And the students that were like, I don't want to sacrifice my life in Vietnam just to enrich these oligarchs that are going to gain more control over the opium in that area. And obviously John Lennon became a target because of that, because he was so popular that he could change hearts and minds about that war a bit. And then when Kurt Cobain threatened to become John Lennon of this generation, and he was anti-war and he was anti-racism, he became a threat because, as I said, the oligarchs are so pro-war and so racist.
We'll talk about John Lennon and Kurt Cobain in a moment, but can you tell us about Tupac Shakur and how he fits into all this? What was Tupac doing that made him a target?
So you had the same kind of politics coming out of Tupac Shakur, whose parents were socialists, and he spoke out against the war, the bombing of Serbia and different other aspects of the oligarchs' agenda. And he, of course, spoke out and was so brilliant about civil rights issues, racial issues, and police brutality. So when he also was able to get gang leaders to call peace truces between each other, like the notoriously warring Bloods and Crips, LA-based gangs originally, but they would spread throughout the country. They were warring over drug dealing turf, and he helped with his Black Panther extended family's efforts to get the Bloods and Crips leaders to call peace truces and turn on to left-wing radical activism and anti-racist activism, pro-civil rights activism. And so he helped that peace truce spread from Los Angeles to throughout California to throughout the country, because he was so popular in movies and in his music that he was influential amongst all youth. And for that reason, I argue that he was a threat. And he also, that drug dealing that was going on in all those gangs were the kind of the foot soldiers of what was the CIA trafficking. And I show the evidence of that in my first film, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, and show how the evidence is that they targeted him and continued. There's other ways that they were trying to manipulate what happened in that event to say, okay, it was just this one gang leader or gang member that him and his nephew have recently been arrested for shooting Tupac, and it wasn't U.S. intelligence involved in Tupac's murder, but it was these two, and they admitted to it when I showed the evidence that just really wasn't the case.
There does seem to be a very conscious and aggressive effort to stamp out any dissent in our society. Based on what I've read and heard from people that lived it, the hippie movement of the 1960s and part of the 70s was seen as an organic, grassroots movement promoting peace, love, freedom, and self-expression as a response to the social and political issues of the time. However, it would appear that this movement was actually engineered. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, well, I wrote about that, what looked like that engineering happening in San Francisco, and a great writer named Dave McGowan wrote about that kind of activity happening in Los Angeles. And when I was researching and writing my Drugs as Weapons Against Us book, I basically finished it in 2013 and was looking for a publisher. His was finished probably around the same time because he found a publisher pretty quickly in Britain and came out with his book in 2014. I came upon his book and I thought I wanted to add kind of a summary of what he had found in LA to just a section of my book. And he found that the oligarchs, the wealthiest families, used either their own people and or military intelligence officers' kids, and basically had them convene in Laurel Canyon, where they also had this Air Force studio, which was basically the largest studio in the world of its kind. It made a massive amount of films with the top technology, and loads of the top directors and writers and actors had to sign confidentiality agreements to not reveal what they were working on. So it appears that a number of films were propaganda films that looked like they were Hollywood films, but actually were coming out of the studio. And that was in Laurel Canyon. So they already had loads of undercover agents in Laurel Canyon. And then they had these musicians that were connected to military intelligence or the oligarchs themselves. The oligarchs, because they control so much of the media, they made these guys some women, mostly guys, instant stars. And people like David Van Cortlandt Crosby was one of them I focus on, because him and a few others held these constant sex and drug parties at their homes in that area. And they lured, loads of musicians and loads of actors into these parties, where there was groupie women that may have been suffering dissociative identity disorder. We don't know, but they were holding sex and drug orgies as early as 1965 or 6, I believe it started. And it basically introduced loads of different drugs like cocaine and heroin and LSD to a lot of these actors and musicians. So it got them using these drugs, inadvertently promoting these drugs, and possibly because there was underage women then, including women that were part of the Manson family, Charles Manson family, they could have been blackmailing some of these artists, that were lured to these parties. But even lured English, British bands to these parties too, such as the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. I have a picture of the Rolling Stones at one of these parties. And they introduced all kinds of weird, wild dress at these parties. Now, a cousin of Barbara Sears Rockefeller was a dance instructor in that neighborhood of Laurel Canyon and held constant parties like that. And Frank Zappa, whose father was a military intelligence, but also part of chemical warfare in my state of Maryland at Edgewood Arsenal. And chemical warfare is the use of chemicals such as drugs as unconventional warfare. And I show the evidence that warfare is not on what we think of as soldiers in foreign lands, but it's actually when anyone who dissents from the government, their pro-war agenda. So Frank Zappa was doing the bidding of his father, I argue, and then he actually turned on them, blew the whistle on them, and said, the government's giving these LSD to the hippies. And LSD was one of the top end culture drugs, as I said. And so this is some way they were doing in L.A. and San Francisco. I show the evidence that they had loads of agents, undercover agents there, according to a number of documents and research found going on there. I uncover the fact that in depositions by MKUltra psychologist John Gittinger, the top psychologist for MKUltra, he said under legal deposition that he was present at several what they call acid fest or Trips Festival and acid parties, acid test parties they call them. That was a scheme conjured up, I believe, and I showed the evidence of by the MKUltra program with military figures, and I have them in my first film on camera saying, well, a lot of us were military that had started these acid test parties, where they would have bigger and bigger parties, and they would. Some people knew when they drank the Kool-Aid at these parties, where the Grateful Dead band played. They were having Kool-Aid filled with LSD in it. Others thought that didn't even know that there was LSD in the Kool-Aid, so they were dosed involuntarily to trip for the first time. And I argue that this was done to both promote acid, but also to hurt their minds, because it does hurt your brain a bit in terms of emotional control in other ways. So this is how they kind of introduced and pushed and propagandized acid as the underground cool thing to do, as all these drugs were cool, underground, hip, and all that, and the hippie lifestyle of doing all these drugs was the way that musicians did it, and that you should do it too. And it's basically diverted the growing anti-war movement into the hippie movement and diverted them from their best organizing. And so this is some of the tactics they used and the way they pushed what's called in public relations is astroturf campaigns. That means fake grassroots campaigns. And so they put money into all these supposedly underground newspapers throughout the country to promote psychedelics and promote different drugs. And people thought, it's just a rising thing that people are excited about doing all these drugs. And it's really coming out of the CIA and the oligarchs who put money into all this. And so then they had CIA undercover agents in the media write books such as about LSD being a mind-expanding drug, even though they knew what LSD really did, because they've been testing it for years, since the late 1940s. So this is how they did what they did to in terms of diverting and subduing the best minds of the anti-war movement in the 60s.
Let's run it back real quick to something you just said. You mentioned that Frank Zappa blew the whistle and said that the government was giving LSD to hippies. It seems that LSD is the preferred drug for the MKUltra program. Why is that? What is it about LSD that made it the one substance they were pushing on their targets?
Well, they pushed that as like a drug for the masses, partly because it made people have less emotional control and be more hypersuggestible, according to a lot of research on LSD.
A tragedy that shook the world was the murder of Sharon Tate, who was pregnant at the time, and a group of her friends in Beverly Hills. Members of the Manson family carried out the murders under the directions of Charles Manson. Over the years, many have speculated on the motive of this terrible act. From random killings to ritual murders, you will get a different take depending on which book you read or what program you watch. However, in your documentary, CIA Drugs or Us, you show that Sharon Tate and a group of her friends were actively involved in the anti-war movement. Can you tell us about that and how that apparently got them targeted?
Yeah, so Sharon Tate was holding these activist meetings at her house, and her husband was Roman Polanski and was pregnant with their child, and he was overseas working on a film overseas at the time, but she was holding constant activist meetings at her home, and you had some of the top Hollywood actors such as Donald Sutherland, Jane Fonda, a woman named, got her first name Seberg, though. You also had a wealthy heiress to the Folger Coffee Company, a woman named Abigail Folger, who was killed at Sharon Tate's house. But they were all meeting at Sharon Tate's house, and they called themselves the White Panthers in solidarity with the Black Panthers. And they also, a lot of them were part of the Peace and Freedom Party. So they were very influential, being these top actors. And they threatened to counter the CIA narrative about why Vietnam War is good and why the Black Panthers are dangerous. When they call themselves the White Panthers in solidarity, it's the attacks on the Black Panthers wouldn't be looked upon well by people who say, how could it be so dangerous if all these our favorite actors, all in solidarity with them? And so they couldn't be framed for things anymore. So what was found by Tom O'Neill, the great work with his book Chaos, which is a 20-year investigation of the Manson family that started with just a feature article for Premier Magazine, where he was just going to do an anniversary article on the Manson family, which is Charles Manson and his family of murderous young women, believe it or not, and some young men. So what Tom O'Neill found after 20 years of investigation is he found a lot of evidence of all kinds of horrible corruption. But one of the key pieces of evidence he found were the letters that went back and forth between a particular doctor named Dr. Louis Jolly West. And Dr. Jolly West had been a CIA-connected doctor who had been working on successfully, he said, according to the letters he wrote, back and forth for some years between the CIA director of MKUltra, and those letters showed his success using hypnosis and drugs to get people to do things that he wanted them to do without realizing what they were doing. So he started an office in a place called the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic in Haight-Ashbury neighborhood of San Francisco in 1967. And Charles Manson gained release from jail at that time, and somehow he lured these young women to get involved with him, and he used sex and drugs and it's believed hypnosis to start turning them into his followers. And him and these growing number of girls and some guys were visiting the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic at least once a week, if not every day at times, for about 6 straight months. And at that clinic, there was Dr. Louis Jolly West, who is working for the CIA's MKUltra program and had success with the hypnosis and the drugs to get people to do things he wants them to do. And here's his success being followed through with by Charles Manson and this growing family of women and some men. And so some CIA agents were found to be involved in the actual Manson family group, including one named Reeve Whitson, according to Tom O'Neill's documents and work. And, they were, using these techniques that Dr. Jolly and West kind of shaped Charles Manson to use and taught him to use. And, apparently, and I have another CIA whistleblower in my film stating that that's where they got their LSD, but they were also likely using other psychohypnotic drugs that MKUltra used too, including amphetamines, because there was an amphetamine project going on at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. And those combined drugs got them to become killers and to kill pregnant Sharon Tate, to butcher her and the other members, other people in that house at the time, about 4 or 5 people. And it scared off all the activist actors that were meeting from doing their organizing anymore because of the attack. And with that attack, they also tried to set up the Black Panthers as causing the attack. They put the phrases like pig on the walls in blood to pretend like it was actually the Black Panthers that carried out that murder. And the FBI documents that were found regarding that murder show more evidence that they did try to set up the Black Panthers. And I have Tom O'Neill talking about that in his book and in an interview about that attempted setup. And so I show some of the FBI documents that were used in that regard too.
It's worrying when you see the lengths they're seemingly willing to go to achieve their goals. Moving on to John Lennon and how he fits in all this, there is a very polarizing figure to Beatles fans everywhere when talking about John Lennon, and that is Yoko Ono. We know John Lennon was a vocal opponent of the Vietnam War and promoted hippie values such as peace and love. By all accounts, he was a very positive figure during a turbulent time in the US. However, it would appear that things started to change after Yoko Ono came into the picture. In your documentary, CIA Drugs or Us, we learned that Yoko Ono didn't pop up out of nowhere. She came from a very wealthy family, and there were some interesting things in her background. Can you tell us about that?
A journalist who was friends with both Yoko Ono and John Lennon came out with a book after I put out my book and film, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, and that journalist said that Yoko introduced John Lennon to heroin. And so that's basically what MKUltra agents did. They introduced musicians to harder drugs or tried to influence them to use various drugs to then have them inadvertently promote those drugs to the masses. And so here was Yoko Ono doing that. And so I don't know for sure that Yoko is an infiltrator and a handler in John Lennon's life. And I only had a certain amount of space in the film to show some of the key evidence. There's a whole lot more evidence I just didn't have time to show. But she came from an extremely wealthy family, and she did in effect, helped break up the Beatles, and she did follow John Lennon everywhere, which looked like in a controlling way. But one of the key things I show in my film is an interview with John Lennon. Now, John Lennon, when him and George Harrison were introduced to LSD, they were dosed. Their coffee was dosed by George Harrison's dentist. When they had John Lennon and George Harrison and their partners over for dinner, he put in their coffee without their knowledge. And that's just incredibly absurd thing to do. And a guy named A.E. Hotchner was the editor for Ernest Hemingway, came out with a book called Blown Away about the 60s, and said that assistant director of MKUltra, a guy named Robert Lashbrook, went to England with tons of LSD, loads of money, and loads of agents, undercover agents, and said, get LSD in as many musicians' hands as possible in about January of 1965. A certain amount of months later, the dentist doses John Lennon and George Harrison. And George Harrison didn't even know what LSD was at that time. It wasn't popular in England like it was getting in America. And John Lennon said it's a drug, and he was furious that it happened to him. But then some maybe 6 or so months later, David Van Cortlandt Crosby of the David Crosby of Crosby, Stills and Nash, he was with the Byrds at that time, but his family was the Van Cortlandts, who owned 1,000 acres in the Bronx. and people who live in New York City know of Van Cortlandt Park. And so they're incredibly wealthy. They're part of the oligarchy. And they made their son, this instant star. He wasn't super, talented. He could sing okay, but they had a studio band that did most of their albums until Crosby got better and better at the guitar. But they, got big quickly at the start because they had this band playing the music for him and all that stuff. So David Van Cortlandt Crosby and some others convinced John Lennon to trip again and George Harrison to trip again, and they got Ringo Starr tripping at a party right near Laurel Canyon in the Los Angeles area when they were visiting U.S. at that time. But by 1967, George Harrison completely given up LSD, and John Lennon said, he thought he was losing his mind on LSD, so he gave it up for 2 years. He said he wouldn't touch it again. And then a publicist for the Beatles, who was close with some of the undercover musicians that are thought to kind of working for U.S. intelligence, him and Yoko Ono both convinced John Lennon to start tripping again. And then this book came out saying that Yoko Ono was the first to convince John Lennon to take heroin, which he developed a problem with, which the song "Me and My Monkey" I believe was about. Obviously, that is an incredible thing to do when someone says they thought they were losing their mind on acid, and you convince them to trip, start tripping again regularly. And it hurt him again. I have in the interview in my film that he couldn't do concerts without throwing up for several hours before taking the stage because he was so nervous and anxious, because that's what acid does to you. It makes you lose a good bit of emotional control, and your anxiety can go through the roof and you throw up. And meanwhile, he had done so many concerts with the Beatles before, and yet all of a sudden he's tripping again. It's messing up his ability to control his anxiety before taking the stage. And so this is some of the evidence that show that she most likely was working for either U.S. intelligence or collaborating British intelligence, Japanese intelligence to do what they did, or because they do all collaborate. In terms of controlling John Lennon, having him inadvertently promote acid and heroin again, and then when he sobered up and threatened to get, came out with 2 albums at the end of his life and talked about getting involved in activism again, they did him in. The best evidence is that U.S. intelligence, murdered him. So
it blows my mind to think that there was such an aggressive campaign to stop an individual from basically promoting peace. It seems that later on there was a shift made from LSD to heroin, as we see in the case of Kurt Cobain. Was that by design? Was it more important at that point to have their target totally addicted to a destructive substance like heroin as opposed to LSD?
Yeah, well, they've used opiates like heroin to sedate the masses for centuries. Karl Marx called it the opiate of the masses. But with MK Ultra, it's a way to control people, because when you come down from heroin, you just need it really badly again. And when you don't get that fix, you get really bad withdrawal symptoms. And so the best evidence is that they probably used that to control jazz musicians, and then they tried to use it to control rock musicians, such as Kurt Cobain. But it obviously can destroy communities too. Cocaine distribution, and a lot of people developing heroin addictions and then robbing to gain enough money for the drug and all that can really hurt neighborhoods and stuff. And so, yeah.
Fast forward, and it would appear that a similar campaign to John Lennon's was carried out decades later, this time against Kurt Cobain, the singer and guitarist for the band Nirvana. I am familiar with many of their songs, and they never struck me as a super political band like Rage Against the Machine, for example. Kurt Cobain's songwriting seemed to mainly deal with personal issues such as depression, addiction, and his relationships. However, it appears that he was viewed as a threat to the status quo. Can you tell me why that was the case and how they targeted him?
Yeah, so he was very kind of left-wing, anti-capitalist, he would probably call himself. He made fun of the corporate machine, saying that some of these bands that popped up out of nowhere looked like they were created by the corporations. And it's part of the way that, as I say, the oligarchs kind of manipulate things in our country. And he would point that out in interviews, and he said he'd only appear on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine if they allowed him to wear the shirt that said, "Corporate magazines still suck." And so he was very political in a more underhanded way in that regard. And he says he doesn't want any racist as to come to his concerts, and he was generally anti-war, and so these are the kinds of views he had. And he planned to put all kinds of anarchist essays on the cover of Nevermind, which sold about 30 million copies. It was a groundbreaking album, and he said, well, he better wait till he gets more famous when people might take it more seriously. But he says these anarchist essays would say how to make your own bomb and how to do all kinds of things against the wealthy and the government, things like that, whatever. But that came out in a biography of Nirvana before he died. So these were some of the things that likely made him a threat, and why they described him as the John Lennon of his generation. And he was the most popular musician in the world, arguably at the time of his death.
Someone that played a significant role in Kurt Cobain's life was Courtney Love. From your research, what do we know about her? What is known about her background and life before meeting Kurt Cobain that would point at her being a possible participant in the CIA's MKUltra program?
So I ended up interviewing Courtney Love's biological father, who was estranged from Courtney Love because the biological mother of Courtney Love had super wealthy parents who bought out the father's lawyer and got a court case getting full custody of Courtney. And both Courtney's mother had been sexually abused by the super wealthy alcoholic father, and then Courtney Love, according to the Courtney Love's mother's book about Courtney, says that she thinks that she was abused when she was very young. And so the biological father, Hank Harrison, when he still did have involvement until about the age of 5 or 6 of Courtney Love, then full custody was taken from him. And then she was in a juvenile delinquent facility at 13, Courtney Love, and wrote letters to him saying, "Please get me out of here. My therapist had sex with me, and they gave me psychohypnotic drugs." And she listed all these really rare drugs that were actually MKUltra drugs used to aid hypnosis and things like that. And it kind of presents evidence that she may have had dissociative disorder or dissociative identity disorder, which is also called split personality. The old name was split personality or multiple personality disorder. But nonetheless, she writes these letters to Hank Harrison. He gets her out of the juvenile delinquent facility. He comes to find she was prostituting herself in her teen years, according to what he saw and what he found and what he stated in books about her. And other biographies of Courtney Love have him say that, and also have her letter from Courtney Love to a boyfriend saying she prostituted herself in the Asian countries to get back to him. And Hank Harrison finds that a guy writes to him that he'd introduced Courtney to in Ireland, and that the guy said on his deathbed that I was actually working for U.S. intelligence at the time. I wasn't a spy per se, but I had to visit the Irish embassy once a week to give reports while Hank Harrison was doing research for a book in Ireland. He was in Dublin, and Courtney Love visited him at 17 years old. And this guy who said he was actually working for U.S. intelligence, he had sex with Courtney when he was in his 20s and Courtney was 17, took her to England where she distributed, brought 1,000 hits of very strong acid and got into tons of musicians' hands and disrupted bands, and also would end up duplicating what Robert Lashbrook did back in the 1960s in England music scene. And then she copied that behavior in punk music scenes throughout the United States. And then she married the top punk musician in Los Angeles, who was terrorized by her until he divorced her. She was handing out pain pills and other drugs along with LSD through all these music scenes like candy, just distributing like crazy. And she then did the same thing in the Seattle music scene. She, of course, married Kurt Cobain and got pregnant with him really quickly. An old trick to hook someone. And then Kurt Cobain was divorcing her, and I have a guy in my film, Eldon Hogue, basically says that she offered me $50,000 to kill her husband. So this is like just some of the evidence in the first film, but then I have more evidence from the FBI file that came out about 2021 or 2022 that show that the FBI purposely ignored the interview of this Eldon Hogue saying she offered me $50,000 to kill Kurt Cobain. And that was in a film by Nick Broomfield called Kurt and Courtney. Now, the FBI was sent that film, and they refused to act on it, saying it's not in their jurisdiction, but it really was. It should have, why it was. So they were helping cover this up, which was basically a U.S. intelligence orchestrated, I believe, murder of Kurt Cobain, but they tried to do it partly through Courtney Love to kind of hide their own accountability for it all. So to throw the scent off them and keep it as anyone suspected in just her hands.
As if the CIA MK Ultra angle wasn't controversial enough, probably the most contentious aspect of the Cobain case is the allegations that Courtney was somehow involved in his death. Who originally made these allegations? And more importantly, what evidence is there to support these claims?
So I didn't think anything of it. I thought I liked Courtney Love. I didn't know much about her. I wasn't sure what was going on with her, but I started seeing evidence from a guy named Tom Grant, who Courtney Love actually hired. He was just a former sheriff's detective in Los Angeles who turned into a private detective. She didn't know that he was an honest man, and she hired him to make it look like she was looking for Kurt Cobain right before his death, when actually she didn't know where he was at the time. But he started finding evidence that she was somehow involved in Kurt Cobain's death. And he tends to be, from what I hear, a politically more conservative guy, so he tended to not look into any U.S. intelligence involvement, but he did find a massive of inactivity amongst his fellow L.A. police officers, or his former L.A. police officers that he knew, in terms of investigating, when he sent them loads of evidence that showed that Kurt Cobain was likely murdered and didn't commit suicide, and that Courtney Love likely had something to do with it. And so everything just squashed all this evidence. Seattle police wouldn't listen to him, despite him being a former cop and showing all this evidence. Seattle police didn't develop the photographs of the crime scene for many years after that. They didn't get fingerprints from the gun, which was highly unusual because it's a shotgun. You figure there'd be some kind of fingerprints on it. And they found a massive amount of heroin that should have killed him instantly, because that's the way heroin works. When you inject a huge amount of heroin in your system, I started in the addiction field in 1989. That was my main source of income until I went to grad school for more mental health counseling expertise, and then for trauma expertise. I've been a psychotherapist for the last maybe 10 years. So I just knew, I heard all the stories that people usually die with the needle still in their arm, because when you inject very potent heroin in you, it really kills you almost instantly within seconds. And so I have Cyril Wecht, the president of the Forensics Association, kind of talking about that in my first film. And I didn't have him in my second film, C.I. Drugs Are Us, but I'm talking about that. And so that's why he says in the film that he thinks that it wasn't a suicide. Kurt Cobain was murdered.
John, we covered a lot of ground here. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time, and there is much more information we couldn't get to tonight. For those interested, where can they watch your documentary, CIA Drugs Are Us?
So it's already come out. It's on Tubi. The CIA Drugs Are Us film is free on Tubi right now, TUBI. For $1.99, you can rent it on YouTube Movie Rentals or Google Play, and maybe about 10 other digital platforms. You could just Google CIA Drugs Are Us. But now the DVD, the physical DVD, can be bought on Amazon or Barnes & Noble and other places, Target website, to get 18-plus extra bonus scene minutes. You can see both trailers for the film on my website, johnpotash.com. That's JOHN, John Potash, POTASH.com.
And for the folks that want to take a deep dive into this topic, where can they watch your first documentary, and where can they pick up a copy of the book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us?
So yeah, the first documentary, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, and the book is available through Amazon. The Audible book is also available through Amazon. Barnes & Noble is also still selling Drugs as Weapons Against book. And both of these can also be, found and bought at my website, which has links to Barnes & Noble and Amazon sites. And so, yeah.
John, what can I say? Exploring this topic has been fascinating. The time just flew by. Thank you so much for coming back on the show and sharing your research with us. We'll have to do it again soon.
Thanks so much, Frank. All right, it's good talking to you again.
That was author and documentary filmmaker John Potash. Don't forget to check out the documentary we discussed here tonight, CIA Drugs or Us, and be sure to watch his first documentary, Drugs as Weapons Against Us. There is a lot of information in those two films that will leave you thinking. If you're catching this show on YouTube and you enjoyed my interview with John Potash and are into the other topics I cover on this show, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. You can also subscribe to West of the Rockies on Amazon Music, iTunes, Stitcher, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. I'm working on new interviews that I hope to have up soon, so make sure you have the notifications on so you can check them out once they're posted. All that being said, thank you all for sticking around. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. For now, take care, be safe, God bless, don't do anything too crazy, and I look forward to hanging out with you all next time. Until then, bye-bye.
West of the Rockies with Frank the Engineer on the Independent FM, Los Angeles.